The Mojave sun burned mercilessly, scorching the cracked earth where a young woman lay, barely clinging to life. She was only 25, her dress reduced to tattered rags, her skin mottled with purple and red bruises from beatings no soul should endure. Dirt smeared her face, her lips cracked from days without water. Her body, twisted and broken, was half hidden beneath dry palm fronds, discarded like refuse. Most would have passed her by, assuming the desert had claimed another lost soul. But Thomas Miller, a weathered rancher, knelt beside her, brushing the fronds aside. Her eyes flickered open, cloudy and distant, and a whisper escaped her parched lips, so faint it might have been the wind, "Bury me here. Not save me. Not help me. Bury me here." The word struck Thomas like a bullet, sharper than any he'd taken in the war. He froze, staring at the broken figure before him. For a moment, the ghosts of his past stirred. Memories of bodies he'd buried, innocents caught in the chaos of a war he'd once fought. Their faces haunted him still. Now, here was this young woman, asking not for salvation but for a grave. Thomas was no stranger to loss. He'd buried his wife years ago, her absence a wound that never healed. His daughter, Mary, had ridden off to a distant state, leaving him to tend cattle under a sun that cared nothing for his grief. He lived in silence, his days marked by the rhythm of hoofbeats and the weight of a past he couldn't outrun. This girl, broken and abandoned, carried a story that echoed his own sins. Her family, she'd later tell him, had been destroyed by men like the one he used to be. As he looked into her eyes, the weight of her words pressed against his chest. He could walk away, no one would know. The desert swallowed secrets every day. Yet something in her gaze, fragile but unyielding, held him there. Maybe it was his wife's face he saw in hers. Maybe it was God offering one last chance to atone. Thomas bent down, his hands trembling, and lifted her gently. Her body was light, frail against his weathered arms. Each step toward his horse felt heavier than the last, as if he carried not just a half-dead girl but the truth of a past he thought he'd buried forever. He brought her to his ranch just outside Tucson, a simple spread of weathered barns and a modest cabin. The sun dipped behind the desert hills, casting long shadows across the dirt yard. He laid her on an old cot, offering water from a tin cup. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks, faint but real. Her name was Clara Dawson, she said, her voice cracking as if the words themselves were bruised. Between sips and shallow breaths, her story spilled out. She'd grown up in a small settlement, far from here, until soldiers burned it to ash in a single night. Her parents were gone before she could understand why. Since then, she drifted from one cruel hand to another, until she was sold into a house in Tombstone, a place she described with a bitter laugh as no house at all, just a cage where men bought what was left of her. Thomas sat in the corner, his hat in his hands, each word driving a nail into his chest. He knew stories like hers. Worse, he'd helped write them. During the war, he'd ridden with men who torched villages, leaving women and children to fend for themselves in the ruins. He'd told himself it was survival, that orders excused the bloodshed. But Clara's words stripped away those lies. She was living proof that the fires he'd helped set had burned through lives, leaving scars that outlasted the flames. Clara didn't know. Not yet. To her, Thomas was just an older man who gave her water and a roof, who didn't raise a hand against her. She even managed a small smile through swollen lips, a gesture that cut him deeper than her bruises. He knew the blood on her story might be on his own hands, and that truth gnawed at him like a coyote in the dark. What happens when the man who saves you is the same one who helped destroy you? That question hung in the air, heavy as the desert heat. Truth, like trouble, has a way of finding men who try to live quietly. A few mornings later, when Clara could walk across the room, the sound of hoofbeats shattered the ranch's silence. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his hand resting near the old colt by the door. The rider stopped, dust curling around him. Earl Simmons, a tall, mean-eyed man known in Tombstone for dragging women back to the house Clara had escaped. He spit into the dirt, his crooked grin dripping with ugly confidence. "Where is she, old man?" he drawled, his voice lazy but sharp. Thomas stayed silent, his gaze steady under the brim of his hat. The air grew taut. Earl shifted, uneasy. He was used to men who backed down, but Thomas stood like stone. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice low and even. "She's not yours anymore. Turn around." Earl chuckled, but it was thin, uncertain. "You think you can keep her? She belongs back where she came from." Thomas stepped off the porch, his hand hovering near the Colt. He didn't draw, didn't need to. His stance said enough. Earl's grin faded. Something cold and unyielding in Thomas's eyes told him this wasn't a fight worth pressing. Muttering, he climbed back onto his horse. "This ain't over," he spat, then rode off toward Tombstone. Inside, Clara clutched a blanket by the window, her eyes wide. No one had ever stood up for her before. The fading hoofbeats felt like the first breath she'd taken in years. Thomas closed the door and sank into a chair, heavy with thought. Earl's kind didn't quit. They nursed grudges, gathered men, and came back harder. Trouble wasn't gone, it was waiting. Less than a week later, it returned. Late evening, Thomas smelled smoke. He rushed outside to see flames licking his hay barn, sparks snapping into the sky. 3 riders galloped away, their laughter echoing across the desert. Thomas raised his Colt but lowered it. Bullets in the dark were useless. He grabbed a shovel, beating at the flames, his lungs choking on smoke. Clara hauled buckets of water, but the fire was relentless. By the time it died, half the barn was ash. Thomas sat on the porch, his face blackened with soot. That barn, built with his wife's father, wasn't just wood and hay, it was memory, now burned away. The next morning, Marshal Henry Callahan rode up, his gray beard catching the light, his badge gleaming. He and Thomas had fought together in the war, and now he carried as much weight in the territory as any judge. He listened to Thomas's account, shaking his head. "These men won't quit, Tom. Not unless someone with pull stops them." Later, Callahan confronted Earl and his crew in a Tombstone saloon, the air thick with whiskey and smoke. His voice cut through the haze. "You lit a man's barn. That's blood in the dirt. Leave the girl alone, or you won't breathe easy in this county." Even Earl, drunk on bravado, knew better than to challenge Callahan. His men slunk out, leaving their drinks behind. Back at the ranch, Thomas told Clara she was safe, for now. But doubt lingered in her eyes. She knew men like Earl never truly gave up. The barn could be rebuilt, but some fires never stopped smoldering. In the quiet nights that followed, Clara asked about Thomas's past. He dodged at first, but her questions were relentless. One evening by the fire, she spoke of her burned settlement, of soldiers and torches and screams. Thomas stared into the flames, seeing faces he'd tried to forget. His voice broke as he confessed, "I was there, Clara. I rode with them. Didn't stop it." Silence gripped the cabin. Clara's hands trembled, her eyes locked on him. She saw the man who saved her, and the man who'd stood by as her world burned. Days passed, her body healing but her heart heavy. She cared for Thomas, saw his kindness, but the truth was a scar too deep to ignore. One morning, she packed her few belongings and stood by the door. "You saved me, Thomas," she said softly. "But I can't stay. Some wounds don't close." Thomas nodded, his eyes wet but steady. Watching her ride away felt like losing his wife and daughter again. Yet as she faded into the desert horizon, he felt lighter, as if the truth he'd carried had finally been spoken. In the West, not every story ends with lovers under one roof. Sometimes, redemption lies in letting go, in protecting someone despite a past that can't be undone. If you were Thomas, would you have told the truth, risking the only kindness you'd known in years? The desert keeps its promises, even the ugly ones, and some fires never stop burning.